this ever continuing discussion of solar. And let's do our usual roundtable introductions. I'll just give the two people that have called in heads up. I'm going to ask you to identify yourself in a minute, but we'll go ahead and Jason.
Good morning, everyone. Jason Bellows, Lancaster County, and current chairman of the commission.
And let's see, Tommy Blackwell is with us, but in another meeting, he's multitasking, so he's just listening. So I handle his introduction. Luke.
Hi, folks. I'm Luke Peters with the Berkeley Group. I'm not representing any of the PDCs in the Rappahannock region at the moment, but have a prurient interest in solar matters.
Okay, that's good enough. Deirdre.
I'm Deirdre Clark with the John Marshall Soil and Water Conservation District serving Fauquier County.
Meredith.
Hello all, I'm Meredith Keppel with the George Washington Regional Commission. I'm the environmental planner there.
All right. Sarah Holberg.
I'm Sarah Holberg, based in Stanton. I'm a land use planning consultant following solar issues for localities.
And let's see, I think Meredith has now joined us. No, not, I'm sorry. Michelle, mixed up my M's, sorry.
Michelle Edwards with Rappahannock Rapidan Regional Commission.
Okay, I'm now going to turn to the phone numbers. I've got an 804 370 4057.
Good morning. This is Brian Johnson with Virginia Farm Bureau.
Very good. Thank you, Brian. And 404 769 3824.
Yeah. Good morning, Eldon and everybody. This is Mike Volpe with Open Road Renewables. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. All right. Like I said, I'm still expecting a couple more folks, but we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us. What I'd like to start with is just if anybody wants to take an opportunity to comment on our discussion from last time and the sections that we were talking about. Any other follow-up from that, post meeting and after having some time to reflect on the discussions that we had.
Yeah, Eldon, I haven't gotten a chance to do a write-up yet, but for the PDCs and localities chapter, I probably will rewrite some of the comments that relate to what I said.
That's fine.
Just to clarify, and then also some of the things ascribed to me were actually from other people, like the concern about if you increase certain environmental, like stormwater requirements, it might create a perverse incentive for developers to just gravel the entire site. That was actually a comment from, I think it was Brian Hoffman at Friends of the Rappahannock. So just a couple little things like that. But
and I really appreciate you doing that, because we don't want to misrepresent anybody, and that's why we're trying to do a lot of back and forth. So thank you, Luke. All right, let me hit a couple of high points that I took away from that discussion, and we haven't gotten the notes out to everybody, but we will. There was, let me begin at the beginning here, that distributed solar, although it has its benefits, it's just not there's not enough scale to solve the whole issue. It's part of the mix, but it cannot replace utility scale and meet the goals that are required. Protecting local control is especially important in the location and the land use process. The statute section sections that allow for the local host agreement has become a very important tool The discussion of best practices was hit on, and that there should be maybe an element as part of the report that hits on best practices, but that was not best practices from a technical standpoint, but in terms of policy guidance. And it really ties to that use host agreement, because the best practices are most accessible, or discussions of them or requirements related to them through that, using that part of the code as your basis of authority for your approval. The importance of how data centers are driving a lot of the demand. And you're going to see that you know, if you read some of the what was sent to you for today's meeting, you'll see that repeated in the presentations by the state agency folks, especially. There's concern that the demand being driven out of Northern Virginia and data centers is forcing electric generation to be supplied by solar from outside of that area, and that there has to be concern for the supply coming from more rural areas, and it's going to Northern Virginia and not necessarily serving those rural areas. And I think the comment was the non-urban areas would not be content with that without some balance. Was also concerned that some of the not good players in the solar development arena have provided information that was not totally accurate. Words like hoodwinked and misinformation were used in the discussion, and that it is unfortunate that those bad actors reflect poorly on the whole industry and hurt the good actors. Also, that poorly developed projects from early on also hurts the industry. And those are some of the high point takeaways from that I got from the discussion. I'd love to see if anybody wants to add anything to that from our last meeting. And here we got another person joining us. Good morning, Adam. Hey, you just joined us. You want to introduce yourself? You're on mute. Okay, well, it's Adam Sillenberger from Fauquier County, and he is hopefully listening in. All right, any comments?
Eldon, I'd like to raise my hand and add something that I don't know if you captured.
Go ahead.
This is Mike Volpe with Open Road.
Right.
One of the areas of innovation that we're seeing in real time is going a step further in the project development cycle to have the projects be as compatible as possible with the ag community, with the conversion away from row crops to pasture land by using dual use solar plus sheep or other grazing types. We're not at the point yet where we can do row crops under panels because it's economically unviable, but some sites have the ability to host sheep or other grazing livestock. So it's a partial conversion away from the ag use as it currently stands. That's something that I think should really be explored in earnest on a site-by-site basis, but also trying to thread the needle on land use and not disrupting the local ag economy through the conversion of the land use. The second thing, and this came from a conversation we had with Deidre probably 3 weeks ago, on the ability to not only set back from the wetland features, but to actually plant trees in the wetland features so that the construction of the array, you look at the site more holistically and you go a step further in having a benefit to the downstream watershed via the installation of the native tree tubes, as she shared with us, and it's something that we're incorporating in a proposal on an active project. So those two elements sort of fit into the best practices bucket. But the observation is that, call it a year ago, the industry was not fully aware of these opportunities and the viability of these opportunities. And I saw a video last week that Dominion has sheep grazing on 5 of its facilities currently, and some sites can host sheep, others can't, but that may be something that's of interest to add to the discussion.
Thank you for that, Mike. You raise an interesting conundrum that has not been lost on me as I've been trying to capture all the work over the last year. And this is such a dynamic environment. We're capturing what we learned from presentations from a year ago. And I'm cognizant of the fact that we've got to be current in what we finally create, but I can't represent that somebody said in April of 2022 a practice that didn't exist or wasn't even thought about. So that's drives.
Eldon, this is Michelle Edwards.
Sure.
I mean, right around the same time we were having these meetings, I sat in on a webinar from Virginia Tech that talked about these options that he's also talking about. The sheep thing has been around for a number of years. It's not something new. And my understanding from Virginia Tech over the last couple months is sheep grazing is more of a pilot project. It's not something that is ready for prime time on a large scale, but that is just what I have been told. I am not an ag expert, so I would defer to them. But yes, I mean, I would love to see more done in this arena as far as row crops, because they also showed that. And again, I think we talked about it during the ag meeting, that it's the idea that you need extra large supports, higher supports in order to accommodate that. And there just is not the economic incentive. And so much of this, it's not that there's not things that are possible, it's that there's no incentive for the industry to do them because they can still get land without having to go the extra mile.
All right, thank you for that, Michelle. And before I opine even farther about what the write-up's going to look like, Deirdre, since you had that conversation with Mike, do you want to add anything?
We have since contacted the Virginia Department of Forestry, and they have provided a tree list for the areas that are in question in Fauquier County. Yes, and intermittent streams and things of that nature. So it is encouraging that some of the incoming applications are considering those issues. I also think it's to their benefit to consult with the soil and water conservation districts, as well as NRCS and other agencies that are instrumental in implementing best management practices on a technical basis. And I hate to say it for you Virginia Tech people, but if you take a look at what's going on at NC State and the studies that they have done in North Carolina, you'll see that, things are marching in that direction. But as far as row crops and so on are concerned, it's not just the crops themselves. It's the mechanics of actually growing those crops, the adaptation that machinery would have to make and so on, as we all know. So anyway, it's a step in the right direction. I still want to see it on rooftops.
All right, well, that brings me back to the point I was trying to make before Michelle added her comments. And that is, we talked last time about an added chapter on best practices and that it be policy related and not get too technical. Mm-hmm. I think what I'm hearing here with Mike's comments, Michelle's and Deirdre, maybe it's best practices and emerging trends. Mm-hmm. That should be considered. Jason?
Eldon, yeah, I was going to kind of tap onto that too, because I kind of agree with that. Sort of dual use becomes sort of like a best practice sort of driver in the site agreement negotiations when localities are negotiating these deals with solar developments. If dual use comes up and comes into play as a best practice, that can be different things in different places, but it's sort of a guiding practice that people like me making decisions are going to ask, what is the dual use on this site? And if they can't provide a good answer, then maybe that's one of the elements that marches toward us not giving approval to such types of projects, because it's not a best practice. On the other thing, in regards of farmlands and dual use, I still think we need to track this trend of currently 40% of farmland being in production of fuels like ethanol that go into transportation. So as transportation becomes more electrical and that 40% of farmland diverts over to, say, another use, either that's food production or solar panels, you're not really losing any farmland to, say, loss to food crops, because you're essentially just converting it from generating ethanol to generating electricity for cars of the future. So
Okay.
anyway, you can kind of take a look at that larger picture of how that transition from in transportation fuel relates to farmland consumption, I think is sort of a point to kind of drive the discussion a little bit as well.
Okay, thank you for that. Hold that thought, because we're going to talk about the ag chapter or section here in just a minute.
And I'd be more interesting to hear that from the perspective of the Farm Bureau and the farm folks on how they feel about that sort of point too as well, because I'm sure they could have more insight to that.
And we really, other than Deirdre, we don't have anybody on from that sector today, but we'll do some reach out.
This is Brian Johnson with Farm Bureau. I can certainly.
I'm sorry, Brian. Yeah, because I see your phone number, I wasn't connecting. All right, please go ahead.
Oh yeah, no problem. But I'll certainly talk to our folks and try to relay just if we have any thoughts on that. I'll follow back up with Eldon on that if that works for you.
Absolutely.
Sounds good.
Okay. Any other comments from 3 weeks ago before we move on to the next
Eldon,
section?
this is Mike again. I would just like to respond to one point that was made. It's a narrow point, but I think it needs to be front and center in terms of the thought. I believe that there was a comment that was made that the solar development community doesn't have any incentive to incorporate best practices or dual use. And I think Chairman Bellows said it best, that if best practices and emerging trends includes this dual use concept, and if an applicant for a conditional use permit or a special exception permit goes through the process and they don't have a good response to dual use, where are the conversations with the local Farm Bureau members, et cetera? Well, then that's not best practices and the project won't get permitted. The permitting exercise usually happens 4 or 5 years into the development cycle when a project's, significantly invested in the project. And if the permit does not move forward, well, then it's a complete zero in terms of the spend versus the realization of the project. So there's all incentive in the world from our perspective to adhere to best practices. And that's why we're on the call today, actually to try and promote best practices and drive it across the state. So I don't know whether that resonates or not. I'm not trying to be controversial, but there's significant incentive to try and do things right, at least the way that Open Road thinks about the exercise.
Well, I'm going to say that doesn't, to me, that's not controversial. What you're doing there is saying to us, that as we're trying to produce something that goes before the commission that fairly represents all the different stakeholders' points of view, you're adding justification to putting forward policy best practices and emerging trends. And we'll all be working together on something that fairly represents everybody's point of view that local elected officials have to consider when they're considering projects. So I consider that beneficial input. Other comments? All right, I'm going to move us on to the ag section. And I'll just say that Andrew Smith responded and said that what was written here fairly represented what he had said a year ago and as he remembered the discussion. I did catch 2 typos, well, one on that section, but we won't worry about that. Let me hit a couple of high points and then let people respond. That the Farm Bureau has taken a neutral position because they believe that landowners should be able to make decisions that best suit their circumstances. There's an importance of examining the impact on land and long-term plans after the useful life of the project. And you're already seeing some emerging themes here. There's already been E&S problems in some of the earlier sites. Land use change impacts other businesses, farm-related businesses, and farmers are concerned about that. They're also concerned about impact on local taxation, as it may put more tax pressure on existing farm operations. Then I really concluded with talking about protecting topsoil and his concern for the ability to reestablish production after the 30-year useful life. And the group's discussion hit quite a bit on that, and then talked about some of the emerging tools that really came out of legislative action that would be emerging, that would be coming online as we went through the end of 22 and into 23. And we already talked last time about the mapping that's now online that the Extension Service has done as part of legislative action. Harrison, who's not on today, talked about how the Culpeper Board was looking at restricting solar to industrial zone land. Did that actually occur? I was going to ask Harrison that. Do you know, Deidre? I know you're Fauquier, but don't know. Okay, we'll have to follow up there. That talked about the community and shared solar, and that it offers an alternative, but it's not economically viable across the board as the total solution. Talk about a couple of the ordinances that are coming online. One technique to limit the total percentage of agricultural land that can be converted, specifically citing Louisa and Rockingham. Caroline County's ordinance that was relatively new at that point gives a preference to smaller projects and prohibits projects over a certain size. That ordinance was subsequently repealed. And so we're going to have a footnote as we talk about Caroline, but Caroline gets mentioned several times in presentations going forward. Let's see, are there ways to encourage power companies to distribute the power locally before going into the power grid? It was pointed out that that was not financially attractive to either Dominion or the co-ops. More on that in later sections. Then there was a pretty significant discussion on the capacity of smaller local governments to evaluate projects and then manage them after they came online. And again, reference back to the solar host agreement as really being probably the most dynamic tool in state code to enable localities and solar developers to work together to address issues such as third-party inspectors. And then dealing with, then it mentioned was the public safety issues and where a battery had caught fire and what's the proper response. And that's something I'm going to throw to everybody. We haven't talked, at least at this point last year, about what that proper response is. There was some confusion there. And I want to be sure that as we go forward, we have captured that probably in the best practices and emerging trends. And so we don't have to answer that necessarily today. I'm just putting everybody on notice that that's one of the things we need to include.
Eldon, I have a question or comment regarding that sort of topic about public safety, and that have we had any comment or engagement with public safety officials around batteries or battery fires or the potential of whatever hazards may lie out there? I don't know what they are that would require EMS responses and what their perspective is.
We have not had a specific on that, and so that's a gap.
Maybe that's a gap we're missing here.
Eldon, if I can, I sat in, gosh, must have been 6 months ago, on a conversation with Stafford County, who was at the time developing their zoning ordinances. And this was something of great concern to them. And they had talked to their fire chief, as well as Dominion and some chemical engineers, who claimed that the cells that they use to battery storage that they use, it would be treated as it burns, it would become inert. It would not be something that it would require any intervention, if you will. So that's the only information I really have to add there. So I do think another perspective with a more expertise would be beneficial. But
that is consistent with what was said by, and it may have been John Bateman who said it. Again, this would be months and months ago in discussions. I do remember him saying that one of the techniques is just to let it burn.
I think that may be a good solution. I don't know, but I'd want to hear a little bit more perspective. The experts said it was a good idea to burn the train chemicals too, and I'm not so sure that's a good, like, listening to the experts sometimes alone may not just be the greatest outcome for us at the local government, or where the decisions meet the rubber per se.
Well, Jason, the issue there is that the alternative is to have automatic fire suppression systems in a closed kind of, shipping container. And the issue there is the risk of explosion. I think in either case, EMS is just advised to not even go in and try and fight it.
Yeah, my understanding is that one of the reasons that EMS does not go in and try to fight the fire is because of potential harm to themselves from the fumes. I mean, that's what John had said during our discussion, from what I recall and from what I've heard previously. But I 100% agree, talking to somebody from, a fire chief or whatnot, EMS is the way you want to go, not just take our word for it.
And
I would also add, go ahead, Jason.
I was just saying, not only that, but just what would be the cleanup response or the effects of such a fire.
And that's where I was going to add, I work closely with our local emergency planning committees, and they work with DEQ's pollution response, who their tier 2 reporting and all that kind of stuff. It's so many acronyms, you'd lose track of it. But the DEQ pollution response team is very knowledgeable about fire safety, but also, and like chemical response is really the big thing, and chemical release response. So that would probably be, I could put you in touch, Eldon, if you're interested in talking to them at all.
Okay. Thank you.
And I think it's just important that as we've developed these best practices, that we make sure that the industry is really carrying forward on these, because there's, such as in that train accident, there's a lot of things that are lingering out there that could have prevented that, but for whatever reasons, those investments have not been made. And we need to make, and whatever things that are in the road of preventing the best practices from being in place from the start of these things rolling out, we need to be in front of now, so we're not responding to accidents and then figuring out after the fact how to clean up that mess. We need to know what happens and what would be the response to clean up such a disaster beforehand. And we need to make sure that the industry has invested the proper amounts of money and investments in that area to make sure that they're doing the best thing they can do and not shortchanging it and making us respond after the fact.
Very good. All right, thank you. Other comments on this before we move on to DEQ from the really from the water perspective, rather than the perspective that was just mentioned.
Ellen, I was just going to say real quick,
Sure.
kind of going backwards. You said, you mentioned Caroline County been cited many times as a case study kind of for their ordinances.
Mhm.
And I just wanted to, I don't know if this had been brought up before, but Caroline County, I think last November or December, threw out their
Repealed.
entire solar ordinances.
Right.
Yeah. And I don't believe, quick Google search, and I haven't heard from their planning department that they have actually reinstated any allowance for solar.
Yeah, and I had a conversation with the Caroline County supervisor who's on the River Basin Commission, and she said that as a couple of key projects move forward, they got such opposition from neighbors and citizens that the majority of the board felt overwhelmed, and that was a factor in the repeal. Now we're going to have to, there's going to have to be a footnote, because we had Caroline County's ordinance mentioned in the previous discussion, and they get mentioned again in later discussions as an example. I think it was Nature Conservancy who said that. I'm working on that next chapter, and we're going to have to footnote that that ordinance was held up as an example, but has since been repealed, and we'll need to do some follow up with Caroline. But thank you, Meredith.
Eldon, getting back to the emergency situation, does the Virginia Department of Emergency Management have any protocols or strategies for dealing with these types of issues?
I don't know the answer to that question.
They do not. They defer to pollution response at DEQ, to my knowledge.
Okay.
Well,
Well, we're going to be writing some emails to some folks asking for some comment. All right. Anybody else before I move us on? All right. Melanie Davenport was with us last May. She started off by saying that she's the director of the Water Permitting Division, so she was speaking from that angle, and that renewables are beneficial to the environment. And then she spent a lot of time talking about permits, and you've got all that information captured. And then that the streamlined plan review for stormwater management and E&S was being developed and was out for public comment last summer. That has all been put in place, and there's significant guidance. I don't know that the guidance documents have been finished. I think Mike Rolban told us at the last commission meeting, Jason, that they were expected soon, if I'm remembering correctly.
I'm sorry, I believe that was the response, like in the next month from that meeting,
Yeah.
the draft.
So very soon. Then there was talk about the House Bill 206 and the requirement for a mitigation plan when over 10 acres of prime agricultural soil or more than 50 contiguous forest land or forest enrolled in a forest preservation program are impacted, and DEQ's will be developing regulations there. The discussion by the group talked about the inherent trade-offs. Renewables are good for the environment from energy generation and decarbonization, but it's negative from the conversion. So clearly the theme of land conversion, both ag and forest, permeates everything we talked about throughout the year. That will be highlighted in the discussion at the end of the report. I didn't mention that one of the things that was highlighted last time was that although we have this white paper report that we generate, we've got to develop an easy to read flyer that really would be focused on best practices. I assume we're going to want to focus it on the best practices and emerging trends after we point out some key factors that we learned. So that's kind of in the back of the mind as we're moving forward on writing.
Eldon, can I touch base
Sure.
on that a little bit here and then go back to some of your original comments? Because I'm the one that was talking about the data centers and the building of the economic benefit to Northern Virginia per se. And I think in that land use sort of discussion, I think maybe that comment came off as us versus them. And it's not, I wasn't trying to portray that this is sort of an urban area versus rural Virginia, but more of a collaboration. And the tool of the siting agreement allows us a tool to share amongst the economic benefits of said data centers, as opposed to not having any economic incentives at all. And that would be a detriment to allowing solar development. It ultimately, urban areas have a benefit in us working together mutually for this to not only provide green power solutions to where the majority of the demand is, but rural Virginia and protecting rural Virginia or rural American in general protects where we grow the food, where the recreation occurs for the urban areas. So protecting those assets is a benefit across all of us, and working together collaboratively to do the best practices was sort of the theme I was trying to make there. I think when you made the comment early on about land use, it sort of came off to me as painting us versus them. And that's not the point I was really trying to make, that it's really a collaborative effort that we need to work together.
Thanks for that clarification. So it's a partnership rather than a versus.
Exactly.
Okay. Good point. Thank you. Okay. Let's see, the discussion kind of ended with the highlighting the solar implementation letter that Drew Hammond had told us about, and the what did they call it? Disconnected impervious surface, I think is the way they specified it. And with that, move on to Department of Energy. And Aaron Berryhill provided us with some good statistics that came out of that Virginia Solar Survey. He said that as of May of last year, there were 52 facilities of 5 megawatts or larger, with the obviously with the larger projects growing the fastest. The solar survey that they worked with Weldon Cooper Center on, 82% of counties responded. 37% are either in the process of updating their policies, regulation, or permitting. 24% had completed updates. 51 of 109 localities responding had reviewed at least one solar project application, and that collectively 80% of the applications were approved. Most are in Southside and Central Virginia, and you see that map in there. And I included the map because when you go over to the map of where our the wood basket is in Forestry's report, and you see the overlap, it really jumps out at you. 60% of localities have renewable energy goals or policies in their comp plans, or are in the process of updating them to do that. 56% have their ordinances, and they say their ordinances have a clear pathway for approval. 45 of the 109 responses have adopted solar ordinances, and 10 indicated they are in the process of doing it. So there's pretty broad response to the phenomenon, and it sounds like the localities are working towards it. Those that haven't are active. Reference was made to legislations that we talked about previously, but then also to the bills that require the SEC to convene a work group to analyze the life cycle of renewable energy facilities, including recycling and waste strategies and liability. And that report is due next month. I am not, I have not been closely following that work group. And I'm questioning, is anybody on this that has been? Mike, I'm thinking maybe you have. Okay, there you go. Go ahead, Mike.
Have not been closely following it.
Okay, well, then we'll have to do some, since that report is due next month, we'll have to do some follow-up. Okay. Mr. Berryhill also talked about that PJM had issued a 2-year pause in accepting new connection applications. And then there was some discussion by the group about confusion in the approval process. And, you know, where did you start? What comes first, PJM, DEQ, or local land use? And we really didn't talk about answering that question. Luke, do you have anything you want to add at this point with all the work that you guys have done?
We we have a ton of stuff going on right this moment. I'll have more to say next month after we go through this current round of applications.
Okay. All right. Well, there you go. That's a highlight. What comes first, the chicken or the egg? Okay, moving on to forestry. Unless somebody wants to add anything, any comments on Department of Energy's remarks. Okay, Terry Lasher was with us. Renewable energy is good, he says. Balance is important when making location decisions. Deforestation is bad. And the impact, as he explains, it can be exponential. And let's see, the need for evaluation of long-term and all associated costs. He talked about the state policy driver being the Virginia Clean Economy Act, as well as the growth in technology and decreasing cost. That the VCEA mandates 16,100 megawatts from solar or onshore wind, and that we reach net zero carbon by 2050. That's 2045 for Dominion and AEP by 2050. The largest energy companies must construct or acquire more than 3,100 megawatts of energy storing capacity, was highlighted. In 2010, nationally, we were at 10,000 megawatts. In 2020, we were at 100,000. 1 megawatt equals about 200 homes. And we had reference to North Carolina by Deirdre earlier. Virginia is 9th in solar generation capacity and North Carolina is 4th. And that may explain why North Carolina, NC State's a little ahead of us on some of their work. We did rank 4th in 2021 in newly installed capacity. And let's see, currently 17.7% of the nation's electricity is from renewable sources. He mentioned the large project in Spotsylvania, and then he pointed out what I said, where mentioned earlier about where the wood basket is in Virginia, and to say that really that map and the Department of Energy map are important for comparison. Average of 9 acres per megawatt. When you do that math, Terry Lasher said we're talking about 145,000 acres will be required to be under solar panel. As of 2020, the 38 active projects, which was just under 14,000 acres, meaning we've got 90% of the way still to go. Of the land that had been converted on that 14,000 acres, 63% was forested, 33% 2% was crop or pasture, 5.2% was barren wetlands or herbaceous. And that was, you know, kind of the concern he was expressing for the future. Questions on cost benefit analysis in the committee's discussion revealed that work is being done, but there's not currently a single all-encompassing analysis. That you have pieces, you have trees as a tool, you have some of the work of the cooperative extension that's called for in the bill, which was the statewide map. And then there's another tool that was mentioned called Bright Fields that identifies old mining sites. And that discussion, of course, brought up data centers and the conflicts between different stakeholders in the local approval process. And I guess that pretty much covers what we've written so far. Other comments on, if anything anybody wants to add to what went on in the forestry discussion? Okay. John Bateman, welcome. We will have this recording posted. You missed some good discussion a little earlier. So takeaways that I'm hearing from today, the last chapter is going to be on kind of best policy practices and emerging trends, and really work at capturing some of the discussion that we are having as we develop this product. The 40% of ag land for fuel that will change, the demand will change as the growth of electric vehicles. That is an important point that Jason brought up that we really had not highlighted in our previous write-ups. We're going to need to get some input from the DEQ, the fire marshal, and the industry, possibly VDM, but I think they're deferring to DEQ emergency response on dealing with the fires or the threats relative to batteries. And we need to add some discussion on that. We need to clarify the rural-urban discussion relative to solar facilities being outliers from where much of the demand is for the electricity, and the importance of the host agreement statute to addressing that as a partnership rather than an us-them. All right, that's what I took from our discussion today that we'll be plugging in.
Eldon,
What did I miss?
Can I make a comment real quick?
Yeah, please go ahead. John, can you turn up your mic just a little?
Yeah, let me see if I could do, is that better?
A little, yes.
All right. So I just wanted to comment, and I'm sorry for the late comment. I've been working with the VDEM and the Middle Peninsula Northern Neck emergency managers. They have a kind of quarterly meeting, a lunch, and the emergency managers and some of the local fire volunteer fire staff are interested in understanding how they can communicate better with the operators of these facilities, specifically as we're now doing the energy storage and there's increased potential for fire. They've had some incidences where they've had a fire on the facility and were unable to contact anybody or gain access. So I had some folks from Dominion Energy and Strata Solar who are willing to present to this group of people and maybe do a facility tour, specifically a facility tour with battery storage. So it's a topic that's on the mind of VDEM, emergency management staff in our region and in northern, in Middle Peninsula.
Can you share with me some of that communication?
Yeah, I'll send you an email.
Okay, because I'm thinking we're gonna do some reach out here to kind of fill in that gap that we have in our work.
Yeah, my thought is, when during the permitting process, when a locality is approving one of these, maybe that's the opportunity to have, the operator of the facility present some sort of emergency plan. I think that happens in some localities, maybe it doesn't in others. And then just establish that point of contact up front,
All right, good input.
Well,
Mike?
may I make a comment?
Yeah, I was waiting. Go ahead.
One of the things that we tried to highlight in our presentation last summer or whenever it was that projects should be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. And I did not participate in the forestry discussion, and I didn't chime in just now, but one of the really interesting things as a practitioner in the space is following the successful permitting on tillable land. We got the feedback from some of the localities that the view shed conversion, even though it can be addressed via setback and screening, if people are used to looking at row crops and you put panels on them, that's something that impacts one of the considerations as you're sort of balancing the scales. And one of the reasons that practitioners pursue forested parcels is that you can maintain the perimeter existing vegetative buffer of pine or whatever the species are that are in silviculture. So as has been illuminated in the discussion over the last year, it's really a complex matter of balancing the interest and working in good faith to understand the concerns and trying to address them. But if there was one overarching message from Open Road, it is always strive for best practices and then evaluate projects on a case-by-case basis. And with that, if there's deficiencies away from best practices, see how that deficiency can be resolved. So I don't know if that resonates or if that'll come out in the final work product, but I do believe that case-by-case review through the special exception or the conditional use process provides the localities to really unpack everything, provided that staff and the planning commission and the board have the bandwidth and the capability to do so. Because without looking at it on a case-by-case basis, we don't have the ability to have project-specific conditions or considerations in the siting agreement to ensure that the project's as compatible as possible with the local community's interests.
Thank you for that, and I'm gonna opine a little bit in response to what you just said. Part of my world is working with the folks a couple blocks away at Capitol Hill in Virginia, and there is constant push-pull between state and local. And sometimes industries, and I'm not referring to solar in specific, I'm talking more generally, industries get frustrated with the case by case of local government and go to the assembly and try to trump local authority over land use. And the battles begin, and they're battles every year. So I would hope, Mike, if somebody else, because I can't imagine with what you just said, you'd be party to some attempt to trim local authority, because you just made the case that the local approval of projects is critical to get the best practices on the ground and do it the right way. Now, those are my interpretations of what you said. And but some in the industry probably would love to have more blanket limitations on local authority so they could move more swiftly. I always see just because I'm paranoid doesn't mean there isn't going to be an attempt to trim local authority, and I'd hope you'd be an ally of the localities when that time comes. And you don't have to respond to that. I'll just make my.
Well, I would like to respond 100%. I mean, and the proof is in the pudding that in the 2020 General Assembly, Walnut Solar in the Middle Peninsula was fully in support of House Bill 1675 that was run by Delegate Keith Hodges that enabled the siting agreement legislation to move forward. That's the project that we developed, where not only local control, but local benefit through the siting agreement was a key part of it. So we're fully aligned on that. And you can't have the State Corporation Commission make decisions on land use decisions. Land use decisions have to be made locally because it's so contextual, and the specific species of trees that should be planted in the dry creeks. We got to get that information from Deidre in Fauquier County for a Fauquier County project, et cetera. So we're fully aligned. And I think that the good actors in the solar industry understand that. And we see the work with the local governmental officials and staff as part of the job and part of the exercise, and the projects get molded based upon that. So we're fully aligned.
Thank you for that, Mike. You're on the record and recorded. And
Eldon, I'll go ahead as somebody who's actively worked with Open Road Renewable and vouch for them as a great partner to work with.
And you had said that before. Thank you, Jason.
Say hello to Craig for me.
Will do.
Okay. That was good added discussion. Thank you, John. Yeah, send that communication to me so we can follow up on that issue. Other comments?
Eldon, this is Michelle. It may be worth it to reach out to Terry Lasher to see if he has any updates to add under emerging trends or whatnot, because I know that they've been tossing around more updated numbers on the forestry side, and there's been a lot of talk and meetings and work on this topic from DOF, and I mean not just through the Bay program, but through DOF's work here in the state. And while I've been more privy to what's going on in the whole Bay, he has the information for Virginia that's going to be relevant to our discussions.
Okay, thank you. You may have jumped on after, I think you jumped on a little after we got started. I had sent all these sections to the presenters, and Andrew Smith had gotten back to me and said he thought it captured what he said and the discussion. I have not heard back from Terry, so I'll be following up with him, and I'll add that to discussion. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Other comments?
Yeah, I was just thinking it might be interesting to know if there's a tool out there that maps kind of timbered managed forests versus old hardwood stands. You know, I know that there is a map that shows the conservation value of forest land, but I've heard from some localities who were going out to do site visits for solar facilities that said it was high conservation, and then come to find out that it was just rows of pine trees and already sort of degraded managed land. So, you know, the little hexagon on the map might be based off of different criteria, you know, just how much other standing forest it's surrounded by might make it high conservation, as opposed to marking whether it's actually been, you know, used for industry so far.
It depends what data you're talking about. I'm assuming you're talking about natural heritage data.
Mm-hmm.
Because there is a forestry layer that looks at productive forest, and then there are layers that look at not just conservation land, but ecosystems that you want to protect that can be forested. So yes, there is. You just have to be looking at the right one, and it's possible that localities, you know, get confused because there's so many different data sets out there. and may just be looking at the wrong data set because natural heritage maintains all of them.
One of the questions I'm going to ask, given what Luke just said and what you just said, Terry referred to iTrees, and I need to find out what data sets are included in iTrees. So,
Yeah, that's very different than what the natural heritage data
Right.
is. Certainly, that's yeah.
so that's now added to the list. Thank you. Other comments?
If I could comment on, as a forest landowner, there are, it's a difficult one, but you could also get tree farms or other managed land that is, you know, done with ecosystem services included. So it's not just whether it's been ever managed. So you're not gonna, it's true the ecological layers may be looking for something that wouldn't include well-managed tree farms as opposed to, you know, something that may not be managed at all or maybe poorly managed. It is complicated, and I was in discussions with DOF, how do you categorize, you know, whether something has been clear cut in order to do timber? It's just really very tough. There's not an easy answer.
And I mean, I would say that certain localities, certainly several of mine would be just as interested in preserving forestry land as they are in preserving natural forests. So, I mean, it depends on the local government, just like what we've been saying. And it's kind of on a side-by-side basis what the local governments are going to be interested in. It's not a one size fits all, unfortunately.
And that's part of what makes it good. All right. Other comments? Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Okay. We've got a lot of ground to cover in our next two meetings before the commission meeting. And so look for more materials coming your way between now and our meeting on May 17th. And please, if you've got comments that come to mind or things that you think of, please communicate them to us and we'll try to capture them. We're developing a good running list for that wrap up chapter. This is good. This is what I would hope. I was hoping what we'd be able to do as we moved along through this process. And it just, you know, slow and steady. Okay, final thoughts from anybody? Going once, going twice. Thank you very much, everyone. I really appreciate all the input. It's helping Jillian and me as we try to pull these things together. And in the constant dynamics, and it's something seems like there's something new, you know, there's an article of something new every day on this topic. So, all right, May 17th, 9 a.m. You'll get some communications about a week, probably the Thursday before. Jillian's smiling because we have a series of all-day meetings on the 8th, 9th, and 10th. So the 11th, look for some stuff from us on the 11th. Thank you very, very much. And I really appreciate everybody's thoughts and inputs, and please communicate with us as you have added information. Okay.
Thank you, Eldon.
Thank you, Eldon, Jillian. Thank you.